Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get past the noise. Beyond the headlines, really.
Yeah.
We sift through the sources you provide and pull out the insights that actually matter. Today, well, it's quite a journey we're embarking on. We'll be touching on some really heavy stuff. Everything from domestic security threats right here in the U.S. To the really complex world of international trade, and even digging into the very foundations of executive power. It's ambitious.
It definitely covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, the material today comes from a series of excerpts. They're published under the banner Barackface. Now, that title itself, Barackface, it sort of hints at a specific viewpoint, right? Often critical, maybe provocative.
It suggests a particular lens, yeah. A deep, often critical dive into these contemporary issues.
Exactly. And the topics are wide-ranging. We're talking the rise of far-right extremism, which is pretty alarming. The complexities in the Ukraine conflict, devastating realities there. Then there's a high-stakes trade battle, U.S. versus India. A look into where Mexican cartels get their firepower. The Iron River, they call it.
A really disturbing connection there.
And finally, a major constitutional showdown. Presidential tariffs are on trial, essentially. So our mission today, for you listening, is to try and connect these dots. These topics might seem separate.
But they often aren't, are they?
That's the thing. We want to pull out the key nuggets, the insights. Hopefully you'll have a few, aha moments.
Without getting totally overwhelmed by all the detail.
Right. Think of this as your shortcut to getting genuinely well-informed on some critical challenges facing the world right now and how they intertwine. So let's unpack this.
All right, segment one. We're looking at domestic cracks, but with global echoes, how the U.S. security landscape is shifting. And first up, far-right extremism, a homegrown threat, but with, interestingly, foreign inspirations. Okay, let's kick this off. There was a report in The Guardian, August 2025, pretty chilling stuff. It found U.S. far-right militants are increasingly exploring FPV drones, that's first-person viewer drones.
Right.
And they're looking at them for attacks on critical infrastructure, power grids, things like that.
Yeah, what's really fascinating and frankly quite concerning is where they're getting these ideas. It's not like they're inventing this stuff in a vacuum.
They're looking outwards.
Exactly. They're actively studying drone warfare in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, seeing how effective it can be. And they're even drawing lessons from tactics pioneered by, well, groups like ISIS and even Mexican cartels.
And this isn't just, talk on some obscure forum. We're seeing actual real-world plots.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Sure. Remember that neo-Nazi arrested back in Tennessee? He was plotting to bomb a power station in Nashville. That was a very concrete, terrifying attempt at exactly this kind of infrastructure attack.
Right, I remember that case.
Or Brandon Russell, founder of Atom Weapon Division, AWD, a really nasty neo-Nazi group. He was convicted of conspiring to take down Maryland's power grid. These aren't isolated incidents, it's a pattern, a dangerous one.
So it sounds like it's not just evolving tactics, but a deliberate push to weaponize these new capabilities.
Right.
What does this mean for the groups themselves? Are they getting more organized?
Yeah.
More dangerous?
That's exactly it. You have analysts like Joshua Fisher Birch from the Counter-Extremism Project. He warns that groups like AWD, and another one called The Base, they are actively, aggressively recruiting ex-military personnel.
Why ex-military specifically?
The skills, the training, they want to weaponize that experience for what they explicitly call a looming second civil war.
A second civil war.
That's stark. It is. And this isn't just fringe analysts saying this. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, their own 2025 Homeland Threat Assessment. It identifies these groups, REMVEs, that's racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, and anti-government militias. DHS calls them the most acute domestic terrorism dangers in the U.S. right now.
The most acute. So the government itself sees this as the top internal threat.
Absolutely. It underscores just how serious and immediate this homegrown threat is perceived to be at the highest levels. They see the strategic aims, the organizational efforts.
But, far-right violence. It feels like it has deep roots in American history. This isn't entirely new, is it? What can the past tell us about what we're seeing now?
You're absolutely right. You really have to look back to understand the present surge. It's like watching a dark historical film play out again, but with new technology. Far-right violence is sadly deeply woven into the American fabric. Think back to the Ku Klux Klan, founded right after the Civil War, 1865, their terror campaign during Reconstruction, and then their resurgence in the 1920s, fueled by anti-immigrant panic.
Right, the nativism.
Exactly. Then jump forward to the militia movements of the 80s and 90s, often sparked by events like Ruby Ridge, Waco, culminating in the horrific Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. At the time, the deadliest domestic terror act on U.S. soil.
So the underlying currents, the racism, the anti-government sentiment, they never really went away.
Never disappear. They just, well, adapted, resurfaced in different forms. What's truly different about this current wave, what makes it so potent in the 21st century, is the speed and scale of mobilization. And that's largely thanks to online radicalization. The internet has been a massive accelerator.
How big are we talking?
Well, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC, they tracked over 1,000 active hate groups in 2024. And white supremacist organizations specifically, they grew by 50% in just 5 years. That's huge growth.
50%.
Wow.
Wow. What are the catalysts driving this recent surge, according to the sources?
The sources point to several key moments, kind of like inflection points. The 2016 election is often cited, with arguments that it normalized certain nationalist rhetoric. Then, 2017, the Charlottesville rally. Those images, the chants, "Jews will not replace us," echoing that dangerous Great Replacement conspiracy theory.
That's very visible, very disturbing.
Extremely. Then the COVID-19 pandemic, that acted like gasoline on the fire for anti-government sentiment, conspiracy theories about lockdowns, vaccines.
The government overreach narrative.
Precisely. And then, of course, January 6th, 2021. That was the most, visible assault on American democracy in generations. A real focal point. And even though law enforcement has ramped up pressure, made arrests, these groups are adaptable. They've splintered, become more decentralized, often operating in online cells, which makes them harder to track. And they've gotten very savvy at kind of blurring their ideologies into more mainstream debates, sometimes through initiatives like Project 2025, which critics describe as basically a far-right blueprint for reshaping the entire federal government.
That's a significant shift, adapting, influencing mainstream discourse. So who are the key players we need to be aware of in this contemporary landscape?
It's a diverse mix, but there are some prominent names often linked by ideology. You've got the Proud Boys, founded 2016, known for street brawls, political intimidation. Their leaders got convicted of seditious conspiracy. That gives them a high danger rating right there.
Seditious conspiracy, that's serious.
Very serious. Then the Oath Keepers, started 2009. They specifically targeted veterans, police for recruitment, heavily involved in armed standoffs, and January 6th. Their founder got 18 years. Also rated high danger.
And
You have the Three Percenters, more of a broad militia network, rated moderate high danger. But then you get to groups that are, frankly, even more concerning. At the top of the threat list, like the Base, founded 2018. Dozens of members in the U.S., affiliates globally. They conduct intensive military-style training, plot attacks on infrastructure. They're considered so dangerous that EU actually designated them a terrorist group. That's a very high danger rating.
designated terrorist group by the EU.
Yeah. And similarly, Adam Waffen Division, AWD, formed 2015, linked to multiple murders, bomb plots, officially proscribed, banned in several countries, also very high danger, and the data backs this up. Between 2017 and 2022, right-wing extremists carried out at least 67 attacks or plots in the U.S., dozens killed. The intent for violence is alarmingly high.
And that paints a stark, frankly terrifying picture. So what does this all mean for law enforcement? How do they combat this? It sounds incredibly complex.
It is incredibly complex. That's the core challenge. The FBI flat out calls them the most lethal terrorism threat inside the U.S., period.
More lethal than international groups.
Currently, yes, in terms of domestic attacks, but the response is complicated. Several big hurdles. First, the First Amendment. Protections for speech, even hateful speech, make it really hard to act until violence is truly imminent. Groups have a lot of room to radicalize people before law enforcement can legally step in.
The line between speech and action.
It's a difficult line. Second, resources. It sounds counterintuitive, but in 2025, there were actually resource shifts that cut some domestic terrorism staffing, even as the threat was clearly growing.
Cutting staff while the threat grows.
Yeah, like fighting a wildfire with fewer firefighters. It makes no sense, but it happened. Third, infiltration. There are documented cases, watchdog reports showing extremists have successfully joined law enforcement, even the military.
That's deeply worrying.
It compromises investigations, blurs oversight, makes internal monitoring incredibly difficult. And crucially, a key difference. Unlike ISIS or Al-Qaeda, these domestic far-right groups are not on the U.S. State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations.
Why does that matter?
It means authorities typically prosecute individuals for specific crimes, making threats, weapons charges, conspiracy, assault, rather than outlawing the entire organization. It's a fundamentally different legal approach compared to how international terror groups are handled. And assessments like the 2025 DNI Annual Threat Assessment, studies from places like CSIS, they agree. Far-right extremism now surpasses Islamist terrorism and even narco-terrorism as the likeliest source of a major attack within the U.S., especially with these new tools they're exploring, like drones and 3D-printed guns.
Okay, so the real takeaway here, for you listening, isn't just about history or distant threats. This is a dynamic, evolving danger right here at home. It impacts national security, yes, but also community cohesion, trust in our institutions.
Absolutely. And understanding its roots, its modern evolution, and the real challenges law enforcement faces, that's critical.
All right, moving from that homegrown threat, let's talk about another critical security issue. This one has profound cross-border implications. We're talking about the flow of firearms from the U.S. into Mexico, often called the Iron River of guns. And it fuels a devastating cycle of violence, really tying the fates of both nations together in, well, a pretty tragic way.
Yeah, this issue really crystallizes how interconnected the two countries are, whether they like it or not. When we talk about Mexican cartels, we need to be clear. These aren't just street gangs. These are organizations armed with high-powered, often military-grade weapons. They exert de facto control over huge swaths of territory.
Operating like parallel states.
In many areas, yes, where government authority is weak or has collapsed. And Mexican leaders consistently point to this iron river of guns from the U.S. as the primary enabler of that power, that violence. It's the foundation they build on.
So what do the numbers tell us? Where are these guns actually coming from, and what kind of firepower are we really talking about?
The stats are pretty stark, and they've been consistent for years. According to the ATF, that's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Between 2017 and 2022, over 70% of firearms recovered at crime scenes in Mexico that could be traced originated in the U.S.
70% of traceable guns.
Right. And traceable is key, because many can't be traced. Their serial numbers are obliterated, or they were never registered properly. The Mexican government's own estimates, they suggest around 200,000 weapons are smuggled south across the border every year.
200,000 a year. That's staggering.
It is. And we're not just talking handguns. We're talking high-caliber rifles, AR-15s, AK-47 variants, even Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifles.
50 calibers. That's military hardware.
Exactly. These weapons literally outgun Mexican police forces, even some military units. Imagine local cops with standard pistols facing off against cartel members with sniper rifles that can punch through engine blocks. It gives the cartels a massive advantage.
This really throws the difference in gun laws between the two countries into sharp relief, doesn't it? Like two different planets side by side.
Absolutely. The contrast is jarring. Mexico has incredibly tight restrictions on civilian gun ownership. There's literally only one legal gun store in the entire country.
One store. For the whole country.
One. In Mexico City. Run by the military. Getting a gun legally is extremely difficult for an ordinary citizen, let alone a cartel. Now compare that to the relatively permissive gun laws in U.S. border states, Texas, Arizona. Cartels exploit this easily through straw purchasers, people with clean records who buy guns legally in the U.S. and then hand them over to traffickers.
So they use legal channels in the U.S. to funnel weapons illegally into Mexico.
That's the primary mechanism. Now, it's important to clarify something. There was this 90% myth floating around for a while.
I think I remember hearing that.
Yeah, it was widely cited around 2009, suggesting 90% of all crime guns came from the U.S. That number was likely inflated because it didn't account for untraceable weapons or guns from other sources, like, say, Central American military stockpiles or the global black market.
Okay, so maybe not 90%, but still.
Right. Still, even correcting for that, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, confirms the majority of recoverable firearms fueling Mexico's drug war still come from north of the border. The scale of the problem flowing south is undeniable, and armed with these American guns, the cartels wield extraordinary power. It's not just about violence, though that's horrific. The U.S. Northern Command estimates cartels control somewhere between 30 and 35% of Mexican territory, especially in states like Michoacan, Guerrero, Sinaloa.
A third of the country.
Roughly. And groups like the Sinaloa Cartel, CJNG Jalisco New Generation, they don't just fight, they provide a form of governance. They tax local businesses, they resolve disputes, they even build infrastructure roads, schools sometimes, filling the vacuum left by the state.
While waging brutal wars against each other and the government.
Exactly. And Mexican officials keep hammering this point. These U.S.-sourced weapons are the lifeblood. They're the essential ingredient that perpetuates cartel dominance and the insecurity that plagues so much of the country.
And Mexico didn't just complain, right? They actually took legal action, sued U.S. gun manufacturers. What happened there?
They did. It was a landmark move in 2021. Mexico sued several major U.S. gun manufacturers. Their argument was pretty bold that these companies deliberately design and market military-style weapons in ways that appeal to criminal organizations. Essentially, that they know these guns are ending up with cartels and profit from it.
That's a heavy accusation. How did the courts respond?
Well, the case hit a major roadblock. In 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously upheld legal protections for gun makers under a 2005 law, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCAA.
PLCAA. What does that do?
It basically gives gun manufacturers a unique shield from lawsuits related to the criminal misuse of their products, a level of immunity most other industries don't enjoy. So the Supreme Court essentially said the manufacturers are protected by U.S. law even if their products cause harm across the border. The case was dismissed.
A big setback for Mexico's strategy.
Huge setback. But they haven't given up. Mexico's Attorney General Gertz Manero cited a 2025 DOJ report showing 74% of recovered guns traced back to the U.S. And President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration says tackling arms trafficking is a top priority, right alongside fighting synthetic drugs. They see it as fundamental to national security and sovereignty.
So you have this situation where the U.S. blames Mexico for fentanyl flooding its streets.
Causing over 100,000 American deaths a year, tragically. Politicians constantly frame cartels as the enemy that must be stopped.
And Mexico points the finger right back, blaming the U.S. for supplying the guns that make the cartel violence possible. It sounds like a deeply entrenched circular argument.
It absolutely is. Mexico counters, saying, look, it's your insatiable demand for drugs and your permissive supply of weapons that fuels this entire nightmare. And honestly, both perspectives hold a significant amount of truth, which makes it a circular debate that often ignores the deep systemic link between the two issues. You can't really solve one without addressing the other.
And this problem isn't just contained to the U.S.-Mexico border, is it?
Not at all. The global reach is extensive. U.S.-made guns turn up in conflict zones all over the world. Often, legal exports intended for allies get diverted onto black markets, fueling wars in Syria, Yemen, parts of Africa. It highlights a much broader issue with U.S. arms control and export policies.
Which brings us to something the sources really highlight: the political power of the American gun lobby. Groups like the NRA, the NSSF,
Right.
their role in blocking reforms like universal background checks or assault weapon bans, which many argue could help stem this flow. What's their core argument, and how does it clash with this global reality?
The gun lobby consistently frames gun ownership as a fundamental, almost sacred American liberty rooted in the Second Amendment. They often argue it's immune from international considerations or agreements. It's a purely domestic right.
But the critics argue.
Critics argue, quite powerfully, that this narrow domestic focus has devastating global consequences. By successfully lobbying against tighter regulations here in the U.S., the gun industry enables a system that effectively funnels weapons, often military-style assault weapons, to cartels, insurgents, militias worldwide. Manufacturers profit from designs that are attractive to criminal elements, yet they remain largely shielded from legal accountability because of laws like PLCAA.
So the argument is that domestic lobbying has direct international security implications.
Precisely. The NRA might claim it only defends the rights of U.S. citizens, but its influence effectively shapes the security landscape and the human cost in Mexico, Central America, and beyond. The sources really question the morality and the practical outcomes of prioritizing this narrow domestic view when the global impacts are so severe.
So for you, the listener, the point here isn't just about foreign policy. It's a direct consequence of domestic policy choices in the U.S., showing just how tightly our local decisions are linked to global stability, security, and human suffering.
And the sources suggest that any real solution has to involve shared responsibility, acknowledging that what happens on one side of the border inevitably, tragically, impacts the other.
Okay, from that complex interplay of domestic and cross-border security, let's widen our lens now. Let's look at the global chessboard, how leaders are navigating conflicts, economic pressures, often with the fate of nations really hanging in the balance.
Yeah.
All right, our next deep dive takes us to Ukraine. And it starts with a very provocative question posed in one of the sources. The title asks, is Zelensky a clown also in office?
Wow, that's pointed.
It is. It refers, of course, to Volodymyr Zelensky's background as a professional comedian and actor. He rose meteorically from satire to statesmanship, promising to shake things up. But now, years into this devastating war with Russia, with a clear military victory looking elusive, critics are asking, is he still playing a role? Is he avoiding the decisive, maybe politically unpopular political actions needed to actually end the conflict?
That title is intentionally jarring, isn't it? It immediately forces you to ask, okay, what political moves are actually available? If they exist, why haven't they been tried? The sources get into some compelling, though definitely uncomfortable explanations for what they see as a lack of political imagination. It really challenges the standard narrative of the war.
So what does this mean for Ukraine, caught in this brutal, seemingly endless conflict? What are the underlying forces keeping it going, according to this perspective?
Well, one key explanation the source points to is the shadow of the U.S. military-industrial complex. You know, that term President Eisenhower famously warned about in his farewell
Right,
address.
the warning about his influence.
Exactly. It's an industry that fundamentally thrives on conflict. Peace means shrinking profits, fewer contracts, less influence in Washington. So the argument goes, for Washington's powerful war lobby, an endless, grinding war is often preferable to an imperfect negotiated peace. It keeps the money flowing.
And Russia's side.
Russia's own military-industrial complex is arguably even more central to its state power. The U.S. economy is diverse, but Russia leans heavily on oil and arms exports. Without war, or the threat of war, and the arms sales that go with it, Moscow's economic engine really sputters.
So Ukraine is caught between these two giants.
That's the implication. Ukraine risks becoming this perpetual battlefield, a tragic stage where both these powerful complexes pursue their own interests, profit dominance, rather than prioritizing peace for Ukrainians. And to break free, the source argues, Zelensky needs to show real political imagination, which often means pushing back against these powerful forces.
The source brings up an interesting historical parallel, suggesting lessons learned from past conflicts. What's the example?
Yeah, it points to Nepal's civil war back in 2005-2006, a really brutal conflict. At the time, the U.S. position was basically flood the Nepali government with weapons to crush the Maoist rebels, a military
It's
salute.
a total victory.
Right. But peace only came when all sides eventually rejected that illusion, when they realized a military win wasn't possible or the cost was too high, and they finally embraced politics, sat down and negotiated a settlement.
And the source argues the same logic applies to Ukraine.
Exactly. Russia is a major military power. Nuclear armed, vast resources, deeply entrenched leadership. The source contends that if a decisive battlefield victory for Ukraine were truly possible, the U.S. would have already supplied everything Ukraine asked for, the most advanced weapons, no holds barred. The very fact that Washington holds back on certain capabilities suggests, to the source's author, that the purely military path is seen as futile, or at least strategically unfeasible without risking a much wider, potentially global conflict.
So even things like sanctions.
Even sanctions, while economic, are framed in the source as a kind of military strategy dressed up in economic clothing. Why? Because the goal is still attrition. Weaken the enemy until they can't fight anymore. It's not about actively creating a political pathway to resolution. The core insight is military means often just prolong the suffering. Political courage is what's needed for a real breakthrough.
Now, many people, understandably, call for an immediate ceasefire. Just stop the shooting. But this source argues that approach has actually failed in Ukraine and isn't the way forward. Why?
Right. The source is quite critical of the ceasefire-first approach. It says it's been tried for almost a year with zero success. Why? Because, the argument goes, it completely ducks the fundamental political questions at the heart of the conflict.
Like what?
Like territory, sovereignty, security guarantees for the future, language rights, all the really tough stuff. Pretending you can just stop the fighting and hope politics will magically sort itself out later. The source says that's naive and has only prolonged the war and the suffering.
So what's the alternative proposed?
Peace, the source argues, requires the exact opposite approach. Get a full political package agreed upon first, address the core issues up front. Then, a ceasefire can actually hold because there's a framework, there are incentives, there's a reason for it to stick. And the source contends Zelensky has enormous political cards he could play, but hasn't. Instead, it critiques him for, quote, chasing applause tours across Western capitals, rather than taking these bold, difficult political steps.
Okay, so what would this full political package actually look like? This sounds like a radical departure. What are the specific steps in this proposed roadmap?
It is radical. The source lays out a very clear, bold, 6-point political roadmap. It's presented as pretty much the only way forward from this perspective. First, Zelensky needs to seek a new mandate. run for president again. His core pledge. Simple. I need peace to seek a new mandate.
So reframe his leadership around achieving peace through negotiation.
Exactly. Give him the political cover to make tough choices. The big challenge there, of course, would be convincing a war-weary population, many who've suffered terrible losses, that negotiation isn't surrender.
That would be incredibly difficult. What's next?
Second, delete the NATO clause from Ukraine's constitution.
Removing the goal of joining NATO.
Yes. The source argues that while writing it in doesn't guarantee membership, and deleting it wouldn't permanently block it if consensus emerged later. Keeping it is a constant provocation to Russia. Deleting it would be a tangible gesture of peace. A signal Ukraine is serious about neutrality, even if it's hard for Ukrainian nationalists to accept. It addresses a core Russian security concern, though many see that concern as a pretext anyway.
Okay, number 3.
Third, federalize Ukraine. Grant significant autonomy to all regions. Ensure language and cultural rights are protected everywhere. And critically, make Russian an official second language for government administration in regions where it reflects the demographic reality.
Addressing grievances in the East particularly.
Precisely. Offering a path to national unity by respecting diversity. The challenge. Overcoming deep historical distrust and nationalist fears that federalization would weaken the state.
Right. 4th point.
Fourth, hold referenda in disputed territories. Crimea, Donbass, other contested regions. Let the people there decide their own future, but crucially under UN supervision. Offering 3 clear options. Stay in a federal Ukraine with guaranteed rights, become independent, or join Russia.
Self-determination under international watch.
Yes. Hugely contentious, obviously. Ensuring fairness, security for voters, preventing coercion, that would be a massive undertaking.
Immense challenges there. 5th.
Fifth, invite UN peacekeepers. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces would need to withdraw, not just from the disputed areas, but 50 miles beyond them. Create a substantial demilitarized zone. UN Blue Helmets move in to maintain order, ensure security, allow refugees to return home safely.
Again, huge logistical and political hurdles, getting both sides to agree to withdraw that far.
Massive. And finally, 6th point.
6th, link sanctions relief to progress. Lift sanctions on Russia step by step, but only in direct alignment with concrete progress.
Progress on the ceasefire holding, on the referenda being conducted fairly, on overall compliance with the peace deal. This creates real, tangible incentives for Moscow to actually stick to the agreement, rather than just enduring sanctions indefinitely with no clear way out.
That is an incredibly detailed and, as you said, radical roadmap. The source's conclusion about Zelensky himself is pretty stark, isn't it?
It's very stark. It's presented as both a powerful indictment and a potential call to greatness. The argument is, if Zelensky takes these bold political steps, shows this level of political imagination to move Ukraine beyond war, he could genuinely earn a Nobel Peace Prize, secure a legacy as a statesman who ended a horrific conflict.
Maybe he doesn't.
But he clings to Western applause, prioritizes continued military aid above all else, and refuses to imagine peace through these decisive, difficult political actions. Then the source concludes quite bluntly, quote, "He remains the clown in office, playing a tragic role on the world stage." The core idea is that his most powerful weapon right now might not be tanks or missiles, but political will. The courage to pursue a negotiated peace, even if it's unpopular in some quarters.
So this deep dive really challenges the standard narrative. It asks you, the listener, to consider the strategic choices, the potential paths to peace, in a conflict that often seems stuck, lacking a clear political off-ramp.
It forces us to ask, what if the real solution isn't just on the battlefield? What if it requires a fundamentally different, perhaps uncomfortable, political vision?
Okay, let's shift gears now. From the geopolitical chessboard of Ukraine to the high-stakes arena of global trade. We're looking at a major economic confrontation. How India responded to what one source bluntly calls U.S. President Donald Trump's bullying on trade, creating its own economic shield, essentially.
Right. This happened in August 2025. The Trump administration suddenly doubled tariffs from an already high 25% up to a staggering 50% on a whole range of Indian exports.
It doubled them to 50%. On what grounds?
The official U.S. framing was retaliation. Retaliation for India's own high import duties on some American goods, something long complained about, and also for India continuing to buy Russian oil despite the Ukraine conflict and Western pressure.
So a mix of trade disputes and geopolitical pressure. What was the potential impact on India?
It was significant. India's exports to the U.S. were worth about $87.4 billion in 2024. That's roughly 2% of India's entire GDP. These tariffs threatened key sectors, textiles, pharma, IT services, potentially hitting up to 70% of India's exports to the U.S. The projected hit to India's GDP was estimated at 0.2 to 0.4%. Not catastrophic, but definitely painful.
How did India react?
The reaction was swift and unified, right across the political spectrum. Indian leaders, even Prime Minister Modi's political rivals, condemned the tariffs, called it economic bullying. One opposition figure apparently mocked Trump as a buffoon-in-chief who doesn't understand the first thing about trade. And some observers noted, chillingly, how similar Trump's tactics felt to China's President Xi Jinping, using economic coercion, leveraging trade for political aims, rather than promoting genuinely free markets.
So, faced with this intense economic pressure, this perceived aggression, how did India under Prime Minister Modi respond? Did they retaliate directly?
They pursued a clever dual strategy, part diplomatic, part economic. Diplomatically, Modi made some interesting moves. He explored warmer ties with China, notably through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, held direct talks with Xi Jinping.
Sending a signal?
A clear signal. India has other options. It won't be isolated or pushed around. But the really profound shift, the core of the response, was economic. Modi unveiled a bold domestic counter-strategy. The sources call it GST 2.0. And this wasn't just a knee-jerk reaction to the tariffs. It was a proactive move to basically fortify India's economy from within.
Right. Looking inward, leveraging domestic strengths. What exactly is GST 2.0? How does it work to create this economic fortress?
Okay, so GST 2.0 was announced after the 56th GST Council meeting. It's a major overhaul of India's goods and services tax system. Remember, the original GST aimed to simplify India's complex web of indirect taxes. This 2.0 version goes further. It's designed specifically to build resilience against external shocks, like these Trump tariffs.
How does it streamline things?
It simplifies the tax structure into a clear three-tier system. There's a low 5% merit rate for absolute essentials. Basic food items, healthcare, education, making necessities cheaper. Then an 18% standard rate for most goods and services. The workhorse rate for the economy. And finally, a high 40% luxury slab for things like cigarettes, alcohol, luxury cars, taxing discretionary spending heavily.
So lower rates on essentials, higher on luxuries. What were some specific highlights? How did this impact everyday consumers?
The impact was significant, aimed right at household budgets and key growth sectors. Essentials like UHT milk, butter, ghee, sugar, now just 5% or even zero tax. That directly eases pressure on families. Life-saving medicines, books also nil or 5% GST. Big boost for public health, education access. Consumer durables, electronics, footwear, textiles, many items move to lower tax brackets, encouraging people to buy, supporting domestic industries.
What about bigger ticket items? Cars?
Yeah, big changes there too. Taxes on small cars, motorcycles up to 350cc drop from 28% down to 18%, makes them much more affordable. And electric vehicles get a special low 5% rate. A huge incentive pushing India's green transition and EV manufacturing goals. Even core imports for growth cement, fertilizers, renewable energy gear set at that low 5% rate.
What's the estimated economic injection from all this?
SBI Research estimated GST 2.0 would inject around $60 billion into the economy, with nearly $20 billion coming directly from the cuts on household goods alone. Yes, the government expected a short-term revenue hit from these cuts, but economists saw it as a strategic long-term investment in boosting domestic demand and resilience.
This is a clear strategy. Strengthen the domestic economy to weather external storms. What does this tell us about India's broader economic philosophy in this era of trade wars?
This is really the core insight, the genius of the strategy, according to the sources. India's unique advantage is its growth model. Unlike, say, China, which relies heavily on exports and is thus vulnerable to global trade swings, India's economy is primarily powered by its massive domestic consumption. It accounts for something like 61% of India's GDP.
61% from domestic demand. That's huge.
It's enormous. So by fueling that engine, the domestic market, through these targeted tax cuts, Modi's reforms effectively blunt the impact of external tariffs. If American consumers buy fewer Indian textiles because of tariffs, the strategy is to empower Indian consumers to pick up the slack, keeping factories open, people employed.
What were the growth projections based on this?
Analysts at Elara Capital estimated GST 2.0 could add a significant hint 100 to 120 basis points. That's 1 to 1.2 percentage points to India's GDP growth over 12-18 months. BMI projected household consumption would grow strongly, 6.9% in 2025, 5.5% in 2026. EY noted urban families could see 7-8% real savings, rural families 5-6%. Combine that with really low inflation reported at the time, 1.55% in July 2025, and moderate unemployment.
Creates a good environment for spending.
Exactly. Ripe for a consumer boom. Morgan Stanley actually raised India's GDP growth forecast for FY26 to 6.7%, specifically citing these GST reforms. As one economist, Manoranjan Sharma, put it, while U.S. tariffs may slow exports, India's domestic reforms strengthen household spending and act as a buffer against external shocks. That buffer is the key. And this is more than just clever fiscal tinkering. It's framed as a philosophical statement from Modi's government. They're signaling India will not be intimidated by protectionist threats from the U.S. or anyone else. Instead, it will leverage its most powerful asset, its 1.4 billion consumers, its massive domestic market, as the foundation of its global strength.
Tying into that idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India.
Precisely. Domestic resilience becomes the bedrock of global standing, global negotiating power. It's about turning external adversity into internal momentum, transforming a threat into an opportunity to strengthen the core.
It's a really fascinating case study in economic resilience, showing you, the listener, how nations can pivot, how they can use domestic policy like tax reform to counter external pressures and directly impact everyday life, shaping a nation's long-term economic path.
A powerful lesson in economic sovereignty in action.
Okay, from India's economic counteroffensive, let's dive into the legal battlefield right here in the U.S., because the very power to impose these kinds of tariffs, the power shaping global trade, is being challenged at the highest level. This gets into fundamental constitutional questions. All right, segment 3. The constitutional showdown. Trump's tariffs on trial. Here's where we see a really compelling challenge to the limits of presidential power. So in 2025, President Trump rolls out these sweeping tariffs, calls them the Liberation Day tariffs. It's imports from nearly every country. The justification, needed to curb fentanyl, fix trade imbalances, protect national security.
A broad set of justification.
Right. And to do this, he invokes a specific law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. It's a 1977 law meant to give presidents flexibility in genuine foreign emergencies.
And the core legal question becomes, can a president actually use that law, IEPA, to unilaterally slap tariffs on almost every trading partner? Or does the power to tax imports belong exclusively to Congress, as the Constitution seems to state very clearly?
So it's executive power versus congressional power, fundamentally.
Absolutely. It's a direct clash over who controls the nation's economic policy levers. Not just an abstract legal debate, it has massive real-world consequences.
And this isn't just theoretical. Courts have already weighed in pretty strongly, haven't they?
They have, significantly. On August 29, 2025, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit delivered a major ruling. By a 7-4 vote, they decided that most of these Liberation Day tariffs exceeded the president's legal authority under IEPA.
Exceeded his authority. Why?
The court basically said the administration stretched IEPA way too far beyond its intended purpose. IEPA was meant for unusual and extraordinary threats, specific emergencies, not for setting broad nationwide trade policy that acts like a massive tax increase. Now, that ruling is temporarily on hold, stayed until October 14th to give the Trump administration time to appeal to the Supreme Court.
Which Trump vowed to do immediately, right?
Immediately, setting the stage for a huge constitutional showdown at the highest court, one that could really redefine presidential power for years to come.
Okay, this sounds like a direct clash. Court saying no, administration saying yes. Let's break down the key arguments. What are the courts saying specifically, and how does the administration defend its actions? It seems complex.
It is complex, with major constitutional principles at stake. The courts, both the lower court of international trade and the appeals court, have consistently made several key arguments against the tariffs, and the administration has pushed back hard on each one. First, the courts argue, IEPA was never designed for tariffs. Full stop. They say the law was intended for targeted actions in genuine emergencies. Think freezing assets of a rogue state, imposing sanctions on specific terrorists or entities posing an immediate threat. It was not meant as a backdoor way to impose broad tariffs on nearly all imports, effectively rewriting U.S. trade law without Congress.
So, using a specific emergency tool for a general economic policy?
Exactly. Using a scalpel law like a sledgehammer, the courts imply. The administration's counter. They argue IEPA does grant broad powers to deal with foreign threats, and they define those threats to include economic imbalances and drug trafficking, justifying the use of tariffs.
Okay, what's the second main argument from the courts?
Second, no true emergency exists that justifies invoking IEPA for this purpose. The courts say, look, trade deficits, fentanyl trafficking, these are serious, persistent problems, yes. But they are long-standing issues. They are not the kind of sudden, unusual, and extraordinary threat that the law envisioned for triggering these sweeping emergency powers.
So the courts are looking for an acute crisis, not a chronic problem. How does the administration respond to that?
The administration counters that the ongoing nature and severity of the drug trafficking, the national security risks posed by economic dependencies, and what they see as foreign economic coercion do constitute an emergency that requires swift, decisive executive action that broad tariffs provide.
Got it. What's argument number 3? This one sounds core constitutional.
It is. Third, tariffs are essentially taxes, and the Constitution gives the power to tax exclusively to Congress. Article 1, Section 8 is unambiguous. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. The courts are holding that fundamental principle: no taxation without representation. These tariffs are ultimately paid by American consumers and businesses through higher prices, so they function as taxes, requiring congressional approval.
A very clear constitutional line. If it acts like a tax, Congress must levy it. How does the administration argue around that?
They argue that Congress, through laws like IEPA and others dealing with trade, actually delegated these emergency trade powers to the president. So in their view, it's not the president usurping power, but exercising authority legitimately granted to him by the legislature for specific circumstances.
Okay, delegated authority versus inherent congressional power. What's the fourth point? You mentioned a doctrine.
Yes. Fourth, the courts invoked the major questions doctrine. This is a legal principle that's gained traction recently, especially with the current Supreme Court. It basically says that for policies with huge, sweeping economic and political significance, and these tariffs certainly qualify, potentially costing households thousands a year.
Requires what?
Requires clear, explicit, undeniable authorization from Congress. Vague statutory language or general emergency powers aren't enough for such massive policy shifts. The courts found IEPA lacks that clear authorization for this kind of broad tariff imposition.
So Congress can't just vaguely hand over power for really big decisions. They have to be crystal clear.
That's the essence of it, like telling the executive branch, if you're going to fundamentally reshape trade policy and impose massive costs, Congress needs to have explicitly said you can do exactly that, not just given you general emergency powers for other things.
And the admin response.
The administration argues Congress intended IEPA to be flexible, precisely to allow swift action on major foreign threats, giving the president broad discretion to act decisively in the national interest.
Okay, fifth argument from the courts.
Fifth, a lack of a clear link or nexus between the tariffs and the stated threats. The courts basically asked, how do tariffs on steel from Germany or cars from Japan or electronics from South Korea logically help stop fentanyl flowing primarily from China or Mexico, or broadly enhance national security? They found the connection tenuous at best. An economic trade deficit, they stated, is an economic condition, not an emergency that these specific broad tariffs would realistically solve.
So the solution has to logically match the problem.
Exactly. There needs to be a rational connection. The administration's response: they argue broad tariffs put pressure on all foreign governments, creating leverage. They might deter illicit flows by making trade generally more costly and complex, and strengthen the U.S. hand in all negotiations. They see it as a comprehensive pressure tool.
All right, and the final point from the courts.
Finally, sixth, concerns about arbitrary rulemaking and the separation of powers. Judges found the process for implementing these tariffs seemed arbitrary, lacked rigorous cost-benefit analysis, didn't provide clear evidence justifying the broad application across so many countries and products, and they warned that allowing these tariffs to stand based on such a loose interpretation of IEP would effectively sideline Congress in its core constitutional roles of regulating commerce and levying taxes, severely upsetting the balance of power between the branches.
And the administration's final defense on that.
They assert presidential discretion in emergencies, that national security and foreign relations are core executive functions requiring deference from the courts. They believe the president needs the flexibility to act decisively without being second-guessed on the specifics by judges.
This isn't just lawyers arguing in courtrooms, though. There's significant real-world impact here, and public opinion is clearly divided or concerned.
Absolutely. The business community is largely united against the tariffs. Major groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Consumer Technology Association, the National Retail Federation, they're actively lobbying against them, their argument. These tariffs disrupt global supply chains, which are already fragile. They directly fuel domestic inflation by raising import costs, and they inevitably invite retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which then hurts American farmers, manufacturers, exporters.
And public opinion reflects this unease.
Very much so. Polls from Pew Research in August 2025 showed 61% of Americans disapproved of the tariffs, only 38% approved. Gallup and CTA surveys found 56% believe tariffs harm the economy overall, and 65% are worried about their own family finances because of potential price hikes. What's really striking is that even among President Trump's own voters, nearly half expressed worry about rising prices.
So even his base isn't entirely sold on this.
There's definitely concern there about the cost of living impact. On social media, you see the divide clearly. Critics call them inflation bombs. Supporters frame them as necessary, tough love for global trade, needed to protect American jobs and industries. But the economic anxiety is widespread.
So for you listening, this isn't just some abstract legal fight. This case directly impacts the balance of power in Washington. It affects your household budget through potential price increases. And it shapes global trade relations, influencing what goods come into the country and how much they cost.
It's a truly foundational dispute with far-reaching consequences for everyone.
Okay, so the administration vows to appeal to the Supreme Court. The stakes are incredibly high. What does the road ahead look like there?
Well, the backdrop is, of course, the Supreme Court's 6-3 conservative majority. That includes 3 justices appointed by President Trump himself: Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. Historically, and particularly in recent years, the court has often shown deference to presidential power, especially in areas touching on foreign affairs and national security.
There's precedent for that.
Oh, yes. Landmark cases like United States v. Curtis Wright back in 1936 granted the president very broad, almost plenary and exclusive power in external relations. That's often cited to support wide executive authority. This history, plus the fact that there were dissenting judges at the appellate level who argued for broad emergency powers, it suggests Trump might find a receptive audience at the Supreme Court.
But it's not a slam dunk for the administration. You mentioned a wild card.
Exactly. There's a significant counterweight. That major questions doctrine we discussed. It's been embraced by key conservatives on the court, notably Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch. Remember, it requires clear congressional authorization for huge policy shifts with major economic impacts.
And that could cut against the tariffs.
It could, especially combined with the lower courts finding that there was no true emergency justifying using IEPA this way. The doctrine was central in the West Virginia v. EPA case in 2022, which limited regulatory power. So this doctrine represents a potential check on executive power that even a conservative majority might feel compelled to uphold based on their own stated principles. It creates real uncertainty.
Given the national importance, the constitutional implications, what's the likely timeline? And can you recap the potential economic fallout depending on the ruling?
Given the stakes, the Supreme Court is almost certain to take the case. It's too significant to ignore. Oral arguments would probably happen in late 2025 or early 2026. We'd likely get a final decision by June 2026 when their term typically ends. A key point, though, the court could extend the current stay on the lower court's ruling, meaning the tariffs could remain in effect during the entire litigation process.
So a practical win for the administration even before the final ruling.
Potentially, yes. They could keep the policy going for months, maybe over a year, while the case plays out. Now, the economic fallout. If the tariffs are ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, it's complex. The government might see increased revenue, maybe adding about 0.5%, 0.57% to GDP on paper, but the overall economic growth could actually decline by around 0.5% annually through 2026 due to the disruption.
And for households.
That's where it hits home. Estimates suggest the average family could face an extra $1,200 to $2,800 in annual expenses due to higher prices on imported goods. Specific sectors would suffer. Construction employment could shrink by nearly 3%. Agriculture, manufacturing facing higher input costs and retaliatory tariffs on their exports. It could trigger renewed global trade disruption.
And if the tariffs are struck down?
Reversed. Then you'd likely see lower inflation, more stable trade relations, maybe a boost to global trade. But the flip side, possibly diminished U.S. leverage in future trade talks, as the president's power would be clearly curtailed.
Beyond the economy, huge political implications here,
Right.
especially looking ahead to the 2026 midterms.
Absolutely. Rising costs linked to tariffs, that's a potent fuel for voter discontent. It could significantly erode Trump's approval, even among those who generally support him but feel the pinch financially. We saw the poll numbers. Quinnipiac found Americans believe 3-1 that tariffs raise prices. And a third of Trump supporters said worsening inflation from tariffs would make them reconsider their stance.
That could be decisive in close elections.
Hugely decisive. Historically, the president's party struggles in the first midterms anyway, losing an average of 28 House seats. While GOP-led gerrymandering might protect some seats, a significant backlash over inflation driven by tariffs could still be enough to flip the House, potentially jeopardizing Trump's entire legislative agenda. Analysts at places like Brookings suggest the GOP might hold the Senate but could narrowly lose the House if these economic headwinds persist. The political stakes are enormous.
So, factoring everything in the conservative court, the major questions doctrine, the economic risks, the political vulnerability, what are the odds? What's the most probable outcome? And what does it mean for the bigger picture of American governance?
Okay, weighing all those factors. The court's conservative lean, its history of deference on foreign affairs, but balanced against the major questions doctrine and the potential economic pain. The expert consensus, reflected in the sources, seems to lean towards a probable 6-3 Supreme Court decision in Trump's favor, upholding the tariffs. Some put the odds as high as 70% that the administration prevails, largely due to that deference on national security and foreign relations powers.
And if Trump wins at the Supreme Court, what's the broader implication?
If he wins, this case could fundamentally reshape the balance of power for a generation. The presidency emerges significantly stronger, wielding almost unchecked power over vast areas of the global economy, able to bypass Congress on major trade and tax policies using emergency justifications.
And if he loses?
If he loses, Congress reasserts its constitutional authority over trade and taxation. But it would come at the cost of Trump's signature economic policy and could be seen as weakening the executive's tools for foreign policy leverage. Either way, this case isn't just about tariffs, it's about the fundamental architecture of American government.
And this whole drama, this legal and economic battle, it also played out diplomatically, didn't it? Revealing how the rest of the world views these actions and, well, this president.
Indeed. The sources are quite blunt about the diplomatic fallout. They highlight that Trump's trade policies, combined with what's described as a bizarre attempt to bully India's Prime Minister Modi over a Nobel Peace Prize, led to a nearly complete rupture in relations with India, a direct consequence. India started to cozy up to China, seeking alternative partnerships. A major strategic own goal from a U.S. perspective, the sources imply.
And with European allies.
European leaders reportedly just dismissed Trump's claims about trade imbalances, like his assertion they were somehow giving him $600 billion. They basically treated it as nonsensical. The overall picture painted by critics in the sources is that the world sees him as, quote, a dangerous buffoon.
Dangers of a fit.
It's dangerous because he leads a superpower with immense economic and military might and has a fanatically supportive base at home. But a buffoon due to what's perceived as almost surreal vanity, insecurity, and a fundamental ignorance of complex international economic and political realities. So yeah, this segment really underscores how these high-stakes legal battles don't happen in a vacuum. They shape international policy, global perceptions of American leadership, and have real geopolitical consequences far beyond U.S. borders.
Wow. Okay, what a journey today. That was a lot to cover. We navigated the evolving and frankly disturbing landscape of far-right extremism right here at home.
The shift towards new tactics.
Explore that unsettling iron river of U.S. guns flowing south, fueling cartel power.
The tragic cycle there.
Considered a really provocative, challenging roadmap for peace in Ukraine, one that questions the conventional wisdom.
Asking tough questions about political imagination.
Watched India build an economic fortress, using domestic policy to counter trade bullying.
A fascinating case of resilience.
And finally, dive deep into this dramatic constitutional showdown over presidential tariff powers right here in the U.S. courts.
And you might think these topics are completely separate. Extremism here, guns there, Ukraine over there, trade battles, legal cases. But the real moment, I think, the thread tying it all together is seeing the complex interplay of power, policy, and their consequences. Often unintended consequences.
So they connect in unseen ways.
Exactly. A decision made in a U.S. courtroom about tariffs. It sends ripples across global trade, hits economies in Europe, India, and eventually lands in your household budget. Domestic gun laws, Debated purely in a U.S. context, they directly fuel violence and instability across the border, costing thousands of lives. And a leader's political imagination, or as the source bluntly put it, a lack thereof, can literally determine the fate of a nation at war, pushing it towards more conflict or perhaps towards a difficult negotiated peace.
This deep dive really shows how intimately connected our world is, how local issues ripple globally, impacting everything from national security right down to the price of goods you buy.
Yeah.
It's a real testament to why it's so crucial to look beneath the headlines, to see the layers, the connections that aren't always obvious, and grasp the profound implications of decisions made at every level of power. So, here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on until next time. We live in an era where information and misinformation flows incredibly freely, and where powerful figures increasingly invoke emergency authority, whether for security threats, economic crises, health pandemics, to justify sweeping actions. The question is, how do you discern between genuine crises that require extraordinary measures and what might just be political posturing or an overreach of power?
That's a tough question.
It is. And what role do we as citizens play in holding power accountable for those decisions that ultimately affect us all profoundly? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.